On my 70th birthday, I reserved a table at my late wife's favorite restaurant to quietly celebrate her memory. When I arrived, the manager refused to seat me. He looked at me with pity and said my own daughter had called ahead to cancel, claiming I suffered from severe dementia and was prone to violent outbursts. As I stood outside in the freezing Chicago rain, humiliated and confused, a soaking wet delivery driver walked up to me with his little girl. He leaned in and whispered something that completely shattered my reality. Before I tell you exactly what my family was planning for me, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who mistook your kindness for weakness. I am Harrison Caldwell. For 40 years, I built Caldwell Freight and Fleet from a single rusted truck into an empire that covers the Midwest. But tonight, I was just a 70-year-old widower wanting a quiet steak at the Sterling Prime. It was Diane's favorite spot. We used to come here every single year on my birthday. I drove my battered Ford truck, the same one I have driven for 15 years. I do not care for luxury cars or flashy suits. When you have spent your life moving heavy cargo across icy highways, you learn to value what works over what looks good. I handed the keys to the valet, ignoring his slightly judgmental glance at my faded jacket, and pushed through the heavy glass doors into the warm, dimly lit lobby. The smell of roasted garlic and expensive wine hit me, bringing back a sudden rush of beautiful memories of Diane. I walked up to the mahogany host stand. A man in a sharp tuxedo stepped in my path. His name tag read, Gregory. He did not ask for my reservation. He simply held up his hand, his posture rigid, blocking my way into the dining room. I smiled, thinking it was just a misunderstanding. I told him my name. I said I had a reservation for one at 7 o'clock. Gregory looked around nervously, then leaned in close, speaking to me in that slow, patronizing tone people use when they think you cannot understand them. He said he was very sorry, but they could not accommodate me tonight. I frowned. I asked him what he meant, assuming they had overbooked the tables. What Gregory said next made my blood run completely cold. He lowered his voice and told me that my daughter Melissa had called the restaurant an hour ago. She told them to cancel my table, and she did not just cancel it. She warned the staff that I was suffering from severe late-stage dementia. She told them I was having delusions, that I had wandered out of the house, and that I was highly prone to violent, uncontrollable outbursts. She instructed them to deny me entry for the safety of their other guests. I stood there staring at him. My mind raced. Dementia. Violent outbursts. I run a logistics network. I negotiate multi-million-dollar contracts every morning. I do not have a single gap in my memory. I tried to explain this to Gregory. I kept my voice perfectly calm, trying to prove my sanity. I told him my daughter must be mistaken, or perhaps this was a terrible prank. But the more calmly I spoke, the more Gregory looked at me with that unbearable, condescending pity. He signaled to a heavy-set security guard standing near the coat check. Gregory told me that he did not want to cause a scene on my birthday, but if I did not leave the premises immediately, he would be forced to call the police for my own protection. The humiliation was absolutely suffocating. People in the lobby were staring at me. Wealthy couples in designer clothes paused their conversations, whispering and pointing at the crazy old man making a fuss. I could have shouted. I could have demanded to speak to the owner. But a man who loses his temper only proves his enemies right. I buttoned my jacket, looked Gregory dead in the eye, and told him he was making a grave mistake. Then I turned around and walked out the door. The moment I stepped outside, the sky broke open. A freezing, unforgiving Chicago rain began to pour down heavily from the dark sky above, completely soaking through my thin cotton clothes in mere seconds. The valet was nowhere to be seen with my truck. I stood under the narrow restaurant awning, violently shivering in the wind, desperately trying to process the sudden sheer cruelty of what had just happened. Why would Melissa say such a thing? My daughter, my own flesh and blood, the girl I had paid to put through business school, the girl whose husband Derek I had promoted to a top executive position in my company. Why would she call a restaurant just to humiliate me and brand me as completely insane? As I stood there wiping the cold rain from my face, I noticed a figure approaching from the dark alleyway next to the restaurant. It was a man in a soaked, cheap work jacket, holding the hand of a little girl who looked no older than 5. She was wearing a bright yellow raincoat. The man looked absolutely exhausted, carrying an empty plastic delivery crate under his free arm. He stopped a few feet away from me. He hesitated, looking back at the restaurant doors, and then looked closely at my face. He took a cautious step forward. He asked if I was Harrison Caldwell. I nodded slowly, wiping the water from my eyes. I asked him how he knew my name. The man did not smile. His face was deadly serious, etched with a kind of grim urgency. He told me his name was Jason. He said he had just finished dropping off a premium seafood delivery through the kitchen entrance at the back of the building. Jason looked over his shoulder again, ensuring the valet was not listening to us. Then he stepped directly into my personal space, leaning in so closely I could smell the damp rain on his worn jacket. He whispered that my daughter had not canceled her plans for the evening. He told me that Melissa and Derek were currently sitting inside VIP Room 1 right at this very moment. They were drinking expensive champagne and dining with 3 strange men he had never seen before. Jason said he heard them laughing loudly when the waiter brought the initial bill. He said Derek handed over a black corporate credit card with my company logo on it. But that was not the specific part of his story that completely shattered my world. Jason firmly gripped my arm. His voice trembled slightly in the cold night air. He said he heard them raise their glasses. He heard Derek toast to the men at the table, celebrating the fact that by this time tomorrow, the clueless old man would be permanently out of the picture forever. The cold rain sliding down my neck suddenly felt entirely insignificant compared to the absolute ice freezing in my veins. I stared at Jason. I looked at his worn face, then at his little girl shivering in her yellow raincoat. He had absolutely nothing to gain by lying to me. He had lost his job, his stability, and yet he stood here in the freezing downpour to warn a man he barely knew. I thanked him quietly, my voice barely a raspy whisper over the sound of the heavy rain hitting the pavement. I reached into my coat, pulled out a wet $50 bill, and pressed it into his hand, telling him to buy his daughter a warm meal. Then I turned my back to the dark street and walked directly toward the glowing glass doors of the Sterling Prime. My boots left wet, muddy tracks across the pristine marble floor of the lobby. Gregory, the manager, who had just thrown me out like a rabid animal, saw me coming and immediately stepped forward, raising his hands. He opened his mouth to call for security, but I did not stop. I did not slow down. I walked straight past him with the heavy, undeniable momentum of a man who had spent 40 years commanding loading docks and shipping yards. Gregory reached out to grab my shoulder, but I simply turned my head and gave him a look so utterly devoid of warmth that he physically recoiled, his hand dropping back to his side. He recognized, perhaps for the very first time that evening, that I was not a confused, wandering patient. I was a man on a mission. I knew the layout of this restaurant by heart. Diane and I had celebrated our anniversary in these halls for decades. I bypassed the main dining room, ignoring the shocked gasps of the wealthy patrons as a soaking wet, angry old man marched past their tables. I headed straight for the private dining corridor at the back of the building. The air grew quieter here, the lighting dimmer, the carpet thicker. At the very end of the hallway stood the heavy, solid oak doors of VIP Room 1, the most exclusive, expensive private room in the entire establishment. I did not knock. I placed my large, calloused hand against the brass handle and pushed the door open with enough force that it slammed loudly against the interior wall. The sound of rich, arrogant laughter instantly died. The room was bathed in the warm, golden glow of a crystal chandelier. At the head of the long mahogany table sat my daughter Melissa. She was wearing a stunning crimson evening gown, her hair perfectly styled. Beside her sat Derek, the man I had personally mentored and promoted to Chief Operating Officer of my company. In the center of the table, sitting in a silver ice bucket, was a bottle of Louis Roederer Cristal champagne. I knew the exact vintage. It cost $5,000 a bottle. Next to the ice bucket rested my sleek black corporate credit card. But it was not the stolen champagne or the stolen money that made my stomach churn. It was the three men sitting across from them. Melissa had claimed she was securing my retirement. But the men sitting at that table were not bankers. They were not financial advisors. I have dealt with Wall Street executives and corporate lawyers my entire life, and I know exactly how they look, how they sit, and how they breathe. These men were entirely different. They wore expensive tailored black suits, but the clothes could not hide their true nature. The man closest to me had a thick, jagged scar running down his neck, disappearing beneath his stiff white collar. The man in the middle had knuckles covered in faded, blocky tattoos, and a nose that had clearly been broken and poorly reset multiple times. Their eyes were flat dead and incredibly predatory. They did not look at me with the surprise of interrupted businessmen. They looked at me with the cold, calculating assessment of wolves interrupted during a meal. For a long, agonizing second, absolutely no one moved. The air in the room was so thick and tense it felt hard to breathe. Then Melissa turned her head and saw me standing in the doorway, dripping rainwater onto the expensive Persian rug. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll. Her hand began to tremble violently. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her perfectly manicured fingers. It hit the edge of the mahogany table and shattered into dozens of sharp, glittering pieces. The loud crash of the breaking glass seemed to break the spell in the room. Derek jumped up from his leather chair, his face flushing a deep, panicked shade of red. He hurriedly tried to slide a thick stack of manila folders off the table and onto his lap, but he was too slow. I saw them. Melissa, recovering with the terrifying speed of a seasoned manipulator, instantly shifted her entire demeanor. The look of absolute horror on her face vanished seamlessly, replaced by an expression of overwhelming, manufactured joy. She stood up, kicking the shattered glass out of her way, and practically sprinted across the room toward me. Before I could even raise a hand to stop her, she threw her arms around my neck, pulling me into a tight, suffocating hug. The heavy scent of her expensive floral perfume mixed sickeningly with the smell of the spilled champagne. She pulled back just enough to look at me, her eyes wide and shining, with fake, practiced affection. She spoke in a loud, incredibly bright voice, clearly performing for the three dangerous men sitting behind her. She told me that I had completely ruined the surprise. She let out a dramatic, breathless laugh, squeezing my arms tightly. She said they had been planning this entire evening for weeks, hoping to give me the greatest birthday present I had ever received. She shook her head, her voice taking on a tone of mild, affectionate exasperation as she blamed the entire situation on the restaurant staff. She looked me right in the eye, her smile perfectly fixed, and whispered that Gregory, the manager, must have completely misunderstood her instructions over the phone. She claimed she had explicitly told him to keep me entertained in the lobby for just a few minutes while they finalized the paperwork. She playfully swatted my wet shoulder, shaking her head, as if the idea of me having dementia was just a silly, harmless mix-up caused by an incompetent employee. Then she turned slightly, gesturing grandly toward the three scarred, intimidating men sitting silently at the table. She introduced them as elite pension fund managers who had flown in specifically from New York just to meet with us tonight. She proudly announced that she and Derek had been working tirelessly behind the scenes to secure my financial legacy. She claimed they were currently negotiating a massive, incredibly lucrative restructuring of my personal assets to guarantee my retirement security and ensure that I would never have to worry about a single thing for the rest of my life. She squeezed my hands again, leaning in close, her voice dropping to a soft, intimate whisper meant only for me. She told me they were going to bring me into the room the absolute second the final contracts were ready for my approval. She looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes, begging me to understand. She reminded me how much she and Derek loved me, how much they worried about my health, and how they were only trying to protect the empire I had worked so hard to build. I stood completely still, letting her hold my hands. The water dripped from my hair onto my face. I looked past her shoulder straight into Derek's panicked, sweating face. Then I looked at the three men who were watching this entire performance with cold, amused indifference. My daughter was lying straight to my face, painting a beautiful, colorful picture over a dark, terrifying reality. I knew she was lying. She knew she was lying. And yet she stood there, smiling brightly, waiting for me to accept the poison she was feeding me. I smiled. It was the hardest thing I have ever done in my 70 years on this earth, but I smiled. I let my shoulders slump forward just a fraction of an inch. I allowed my eyes to wander aimlessly around the room for a few seconds, letting a dull, vacant expression wash over my face. I relaxed the firm grip of my hands, letting them tremble slightly in Melissa's grasp. If my daughter wanted to convince these dangerous men that her father was a confused, dementia-ridden old fool, I decided to give them an Oscar-winning performance. I patted her hand gently, letting my voice waver just enough to sound fragile. I told her that I was just so surprised. I said I thought I was only coming for a simple steak, and that all these bright lights and loud noises had startled me. Melissa exhaled a massive sigh of relief. The tension in her shoulders vanished instantly. She turned to Derek and shot him a victorious, triumphant look. She really believed I was losing my mind. She honestly thought her brilliant deception had worked perfectly. She gently guided me to a plush leather chair at the head of the table, treating me like a piece of fragile, broken glass. I sat down heavily, pretending to struggle with my wet coat. Derek quickly snapped his fingers, gesturing for a waiter who was cowering in the corner of the room. He ordered the man to bring me a warm towel and a glass of hot water. Derek then turned to me, plastering a sickeningly sweet smile across his face. He leaned over, placing a hand on my shoulder, and spoke in a slow, overly articulated voice. He told me to just relax, to catch my breath, and let them handle the complicated grown-up business. I nodded slowly, keeping my vacant smile firmly in place. I turned my attention to the three men sitting across the mahogany table. Up close, the illusion of them being financial experts completely fell apart. The man with the jagged neck scar leaned forward. He rested his massive, calloused hands on the pristine white tablecloth. He looked at me with eyes that possessed absolutely no human warmth. Yet when he spoke, his tone was horribly patronizing. He asked me how I was feeling today, in a high-pitched musical voice usually reserved for speaking to a toddler. He told me that I had built a very nice company, and that they were going to take excellent care of it for me. The man with the broken nose chimed in, loudly agreeing. He pointed to his champagne glass, speaking slowly and loudly, asking if I wanted a little sip of the bubbly juice. It took every ounce of discipline I possessed not to reach across the table and grab him by his tailored throat. I have negotiated hostile takeovers with the most cutthroat corporate raiders in America. I have stared down union strikes and weathered brutal economic recessions. Yet here I was being mocked by common thugs wearing expensive suits bought with my money. I simply chuckled a weak, reedy sound and politely declined the drink. I told them my doctor said alcohol makes my head feel cloudy these days. Melissa immediately chimed in loudly, praising my wise decision. She leaned over to the scarred man and whispered loudly enough for me to hear. She said, "I have good days and bad days, and that tonight was clearly one of my more confused evenings." The scarred man nodded sympathetically, but his dead eyes remained fixed on my face, analyzing me like a butcher evaluating a piece of meat. As the waiter returned with a warm towel, I began to wipe the rain from my face and hands. I kept my head down, using the towel to shield my eyes so I could observe the room without being noticed. That is when I saw it. Derek reached out to pour more champagne for the scarred man. As his arm extended, the cuff of his dress shirt pulled back, revealing a massive, incredibly intricate timepiece on his left wrist. It was a Richard Mille. I recognized the distinctive tonneau-shaped case and the complex skeletonized movement instantly. A watch like that retails for roughly $150,000, sometimes more, depending on the specific model. My mind performed a rapid, terrifying calculation. As the chief operating officer of Caldwell Freight, Derek earns a very generous salary, of $300,000 a year. Even with annual bonuses, it is mathematically impossible for him to casually purchase a watch that costs half his yearly gross income without drawing massive financial attention. The math simply did not work, unless, of course, the money came from a completely different, undocumented source. I stared at the sweeping hands of that obscenely expensive watch, feeling a cold knot form deep in my stomach. The puzzle pieces were beginning to connect, forming a picture far darker than simple corporate greed. I shifted my gaze beneath the towel, watching the subtle body language of the men at the table. In any standard business meeting, the power dynamic is obvious. People naturally look toward the person holding the purse strings. I own 80% of Caldwell Freight. I am the sole founder and the absolute final authority on any major financial decision. Yet not a single one of these supposed investors looked at me for approval. When they spoke about shipping routes, warehouse capacities, and liquidating assets, they directed their questions entirely to Derek. The man with the broken nose tapped a thick finger against the table. He looked directly at Derek, completely ignoring my presence at the head of the table. He said they needed access to the Southside distribution hub by next Tuesday, no exceptions. He stated that the shipments were coming in heavy and they needed total operational clearance. He then nodded respectfully and called Derek boss. Boss. That single terrifying word echoed endlessly in my racing mind, like a loud, deafening gunshot fired directly into the pitch-black dark. These hardened, violent men did not answer to my son-in-law because he was a clever corporate executive. They called him boss because he was facilitating something massive for them. Derek smiled arrogantly at the men confidently taking a very slow sip of his chilled $5,000 vintage champagne. He quickly adjusted his newly stolen luxury watch and confidently assured the scarred man that the Southside warehouse would be completely cleared of standard inventory and ready for their private use by Monday night. He promised them that there would be absolutely no security cameras active and no inconvenient questions asked. Melissa sat beside him, beaming with pride, utterly blind to the fact that her husband was selling my life's work to the criminal underworld. I kept my trembling, confused smile perfectly frozen on my face, while deep inside my chest, the loving father they once knew completely died. He was instantly replaced by a hardened man ready to burn them to ashes without any hesitation or a single ounce of mercy, no matter the final cost. The air in the private dining room felt increasingly heavy, suffocating, under the weight of their blatant deception. I sat at the head of the table, perfectly maintaining my carefully constructed mask of a bewildered, deteriorating old man. Derek poured another glass of the ridiculously expensive champagne for the man with the jagged scar, chatting smoothly about profit margins and logistics grids. They were discussing my warehouses, my fleet of trucks, and my life's work, as if I were already dead and buried. My daughter Melissa sat right next to them, smiling, a hollow-painted smile completely complicit in the theft of my empire. I knew I needed to get out of this room. More importantly, I needed to know exactly what kind of legal trap they were planning to spring on me. Derek had covered a stack of documents when I first burst through the doors. I needed to see those papers. I needed undeniable proof. I waited for the conversation to shift back to their shady shipping schedules. The scarred man was loudly explaining how his associates needed absolute, unquestioned access to the loading bays by midnight on weekends. I let my hands tremble a little more violently. I reached for the heavy silver fork resting beside my untouched plate of food. With a calculated, clumsy twitch of my fingers, I swatted the utensil off the edge of the mahogany table. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, ringing clatter that cut straight through their sinister business talk. Melissa flinched, letting out an exaggerated sigh of annoyance. Derek rolled his eyes, his mask slipping for just a fraction of a second before he remembered to play the caring son-in-law. He snapped his fingers at the waiter, demanding a replacement immediately. I waved my hands erratically, slurring my words just a bit to sound stubborn and disoriented. I told them not to bother the poor waiter, insisting that I could get it myself. I muttered about how I hated wasting good silverware, sounding exactly like a stubborn elderly man losing his grip on reality. Before Derek could stop me, I slid out of my plush leather chair and awkwardly lowered myself down onto the floor. The long, heavy white tablecloth draped over the edges, creating a dark, secluded tent beneath the table. The moment I was out of their direct line of sight, the trembling in my hands stopped entirely. My breathing steadied. I was no longer a confused patient. I was a man searching for the weapon they intended to use against me. I scanned the floor quickly. Derek was sitting directly to my right. He had hastily shoved his leather briefcase backward when I entered the room. Next to the briefcase, carelessly pushed underneath the shadows of his chair, was a thick manila folder. It had slipped partially open when he tossed it down. I carefully crawled a few inches closer, ignoring the sharp pain in my old knees. The lighting under the table was very dim, but my vision was perfectly fine. I adjusted my angle to read the upside-down text printed across the top of the thick stack of legal papers. The bold black letters hit me harder than a physical punch to the gut. The first document was boldly titled, "Full Medical Conservatorship." The pages detailed a complete transfer of my medical and personal rights directly to Melissa, citing severe cognitive decline and an inability to care for myself. Beneath that was a second set of documents titled Asset Liquidation and Wealth Transfer Authorization. My blood ran completely cold as I stared at the bottom of the visible page. There, resting on the signature line, was my own name. It was an absolute flawless forgery. Someone had painstakingly copied the exact loop and slant of my signature, binding my entire fortune, my company, and my freedom over to the very people planning to destroy me. This was not a simple scheme to steal money. This was a calculated, legally binding execution. They were going to trap me in a medical nightmare, drug me into submission, and legally liquidate every single asset I had built over the last 40 years. I stared at the forged ink, feeling a wave of absolute disgust. I was sitting in a room with monsters. The men above me were cartel enforcers, but the real monsters were the ones I had welcomed into my own family. I grabbed my dropped fork and slowly backed away from Derek's chair. I took a deep, silent breath, preparing myself for the performance of a lifetime. I needed to leave this restaurant immediately. But if I walked out looking angry or suspicious, Derek and his violent associates would realize I understood their plan. They would not let me leave this building alive. I had to make them believe I was completely broken. I pushed myself up from the floor, intentionally knocking my head lightly against the edge of the table to create a dull thud. I emerged from under the tablecloth, letting the silver fork slip from my fingers and clatter onto the floor once again. I stood up, swaying heavily on my feet. I brought my hand up to my chest, clutching the fabric of my shirt tightly. I let my breathing become rapid and shallow, taking short, panicked gasps of air. I widened my eyes, staring blankly at the far wall, completely ignoring everyone at the table. Melissa jumped up from her seat, her voice dripping with fake concern. She grabbed my arm loudly, asking what was wrong. I slumped my weight against her just enough to make her struggle, mumbling incoherently about the room spinning and a sharp pain in my head. I told her I felt very dizzy, that the lights were too bright, and that I needed to go home right now to lie down. Derek stepped back, clearly eager to keep his distance. He looked at the cartel men, offering a tight, apologetic smile. He told them the old man was having another one of his bad episodes and needed to be sent away before he caused a real disturbance. Melissa nodded vigorously, her grip on my arm tightening like a vice. She did not look worried for my health. I could see the poorly concealed relief shining brightly in her eyes. My sudden illness was the perfect excuse to get me out of the room so they could finish signing my life away to the criminal underworld. She snapped at Derek to call a taxi immediately, explicitly stating that she could not leave her important guests to drive me herself. Derek rushed out to the lobby to secure a car. Melissa guided me toward the exit, keeping a firm hold on my elbow. She patted my back with mocking gentleness, whispering that everything would be fine once I was safely locked away in my bed. We walked through the restaurant lobby. Gregory, the manager, watched us pass with that same pathetic look of pity. I continued to stumble, keeping my head bowed, playing the role of a defeated, broken man all the way out into the freezing downpour. A yellow taxi was waiting at the curb. Derek pulled the passenger door open, the rain soaking his expensive suit. He shoved a $50 bill into the driver's hand, ordering him to take me straight to my address and ensure I got inside. Melissa leaned into the cab, planting a cold, superficial kiss on my wet cheek. She told me to get a good night of sleep, promising she would come see me very early the next morning. I knew exactly what she meant by that promise. She was coming to drag me to a psychiatric ward. I slumped into the back seat, letting my eyes flutter shut, as if I were drifting into a state of total confusion. Derek slammed the heavy car door shut. Through the rain-streaked window, I watched my daughter and my son-in-law quickly turn their backs on me and hurry inside the warm, luxurious restaurant to finish selling my soul. The taxi driver put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb, merging into the dark, wet Chicago traffic. The moment the glowing neon sign of the Sterling Prime faded from my view in the rearview mirror, my entire posture completely transformed. I sat up perfectly straight in the back seat of the cab. I smoothed the wrinkles from my damp jacket. My breathing slowed to a calm, steady rhythm. The confusion and weakness vanished from my face, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my cell phone. My hands were completely steady. I dialed the number I had memorized just minutes ago. The phone rang twice before a hesitant voice answered on the other end. I spoke clearly, my voice sharp and commanding. I told Jason to meet me at my lawyer's private downtown office in exactly 30 minutes. I told him we had a company to take back. I ended the call with Jason. As the taxi sped through the rainy streets of Chicago, a sudden realization hit me. Going to a high-profile law office now would leave a digital footprint. Derek was undoubtedly monitoring my movements through company security accounts. I needed an untraceable location to talk to this driver. I called Jason back and changed our meeting spot. I leaned forward, tapped the plexiglass divider, and handed the cab driver another $100 bill. I instructed him to divert from my home address and take me to an old rundown diner on the industrial outskirts of the South Side. It was a place where night shift dock workers ate far away from the polished world of Lincoln Park and my son-in-law. The diner was empty when I walked in. Harsh fluorescent lights hummed above illuminating faded vinyl booths and checkered linoleum floors. The smell of stale coffee and fried grease hung heavily in the air. I chose a corner booth facing the door, sitting with my back against the wall. I ordered a black coffee and waited. 10 minutes later, the door swung open, letting in a gust of freezing wind. Jason stepped inside, looking exhausted and completely soaked. He was holding the hand of his little girl, who clutched a worn teddy bear against her yellow raincoat. I raised my hand, gesturing for them to join me. Jason slid into the booth opposite me, lifting his daughter to sit beside him. She looked at me with wide, tired eyes. I flagged down the waitress and ordered a hot chocolate and warm pancakes for the girl. Jason looked at me with a mixture of gratitude and intense apprehension. He rubbed his face with his cold hands, taking a deep breath before speaking. I asked him to tell me everything. I needed to know why a delivery driver was willing to risk his job to warn a complete stranger about a private corporate meeting. Jason did not look away. He stared directly into my eyes. His voice carried the heavy weight of a man who had lost everything. He told me he was not just a delivery driver. Until 3 months ago, his name was on the payroll of Caldwell Freight and Fleet. He was our senior information technology auditor. He had worked at my company for 7 years, climbing the ranks with a spotless record and a reputation for unshakable integrity. He knew the complex architecture of our internal servers better than anyone else in the entire building. My mind raced as I processed this. I asked him why he was no longer employed at my firm. Jason clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists on the table. He explained that late one evening, while running a routine diagnostic check on the quarterly financial transfers, he stumbled upon a massive anomaly. Millions of dollars were quietly hemorrhaging from our primary operational accounts. The money was being carefully siphoned off in small increments, routed through a complex maze of external vendors and anonymous offshore holding companies. Jason said he compiled a detailed forensic report, intending to bring it directly to my desk the next morning. But he never made it to my office. Derek intercepted him. As Chief Operating Officer, Derek had the authority to monitor all internal network traffic. He saw Jason pulling the restricted financial data. Before Jason could even print the final audit, Derek called him into a private conference room. Derek did not just fire him, he completely destroyed him. He accessed Jason's workstation and planted a trail of fabricated evidence, making it look as though Jason was actively embezzling company funds. Derek threatened to hand the fake files over to federal authorities and have Jason locked away for decades if he breathed a single word of the truth to anyone. Jason looked down at his daughter, who was happily eating her warm pancakes, completely unaware of the terrifying world around her. He told me his wife had passed away 2 years ago, leaving him as the sole provider for his little girl. He could not afford a lengthy legal battle against a corporate giant, and he could not risk going to federal prison and leaving his daughter to enter the foster care system. He took the horrific deal. He signed a non-disclosure agreement, walked out of the building in absolute disgrace, and lost his professional career. With his reputation ruined in the corporate finance sector, he was forced to take low-paying gig work just to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. The scale of Derek's calculated malice was staggering. He had ruined an innocent, hard-working father just to protect his own criminal enterprise. I felt a deep wave of guilt wash over me. This brilliant, loyal employee had been brutally discarded under my own roof, and I had been completely blind to it. I looked back at Jason. The fear and exhaustion in his eyes were entirely genuine. He had every reason in the world to hate my family, to walk away and let me fall into Derek's trap. Yet he had stepped out of the shadows in the freezing rain to save my life. I reached across the table and placed my hands firmly over his. I spoke in a quiet, steady voice. I told him that the injustice he suffered was entirely my fault, because a true leader should always know when wolves are hunting inside his own house. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that as of this exact second, he was officially hired back at Caldwell Freight and Fleet. I promised him that if he helped me expose this monumental betrayal, I would not only clear his name and restore his professional reputation, but I would personally ensure he and his daughter never had to struggle for a single thing again. Jason exhaled a long, shaky breath, wiping a stray tear from his cheek. He nodded slowly, a spark of renewed determination igniting in his eyes. He asked me what we needed to do. I laid out the stark reality. I explained the forged medical conservatorship and the asset liquidation papers I had seen under the table. I told him that by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, my daughter would try to have me dragged out of my home and locked away in a psychiatric facility. We did not have days to build a legal case. We only had a few precious hours. We formed an unbreakable pact right there in that diner booth. We were going to become a two-man strike team. We needed to bypass Derek's internal corporate security, infiltrate the servers, and extract every piece of evidence proving the embezzlement and the cartel money laundering. We had to move faster than they could anticipate. I paid for the meal and stood up, buttoning my coat. I told Jason to grab his daughter and get into the taxi outside. We were heading to a secure location where no one could track us. The time for hiding was over. Tonight, the hunted would become the hunters. The tires of the taxi hissed against the rain-slicked pavement as we drove deep into downtown Chicago. The digital clock on the dashboard glowed a harsh green, reading exactly 10:30 at night. The city outside was a blur of neon reflections and endless concrete, but inside the cab, the silence was heavy. I directed the driver to a secure private loft I owned under a discreet holding company. It was a property my daughter Melissa and her husband Derek knew absolutely nothing about. I originally purchased it as a quiet corporate retreat for sensitive negotiations, but tonight it was going to serve as our central command bunker. The cab pulled to a stop in a dark, narrow alleyway behind an unassuming brick building. I paid the driver, making sure he did not linger, and led Jason and his little girl to a reinforced steel door. I punched a complex security code into the keypad. The heavy locks disengaged with a solid, reassuring thud. We stepped into the dry, cavernous loft. The space was minimalist, dominated by a massive glass conference table and several high-end computer terminals. Jason gently carried his exhausted daughter over to a plush leather sofa, carefully wrapping her in a warm woolen blanket. She was asleep before her head hit the armrest. He stood up, running a hand through his damp hair, looking around the sophisticated room with a renewed sense of focus. I pointed him toward the main server hub in the corner, telling him to get the machines booted up and ready for immediate network penetration. While he began typing furiously, completely in his element, I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the glittering skyline. I pulled my phone from my pocket. It was time to bring in the heavy artillery. I dialed a number I had not called this late at night in over 20 years. It belonged to Victor Cross. Victor was not just a corporate lawyer. He was a legal predator, a man who had spent the last 4 decades swimming in the bloodiest, most treacherous waters of corporate litigation. He was my personal attorney, my shield, and my primary weapon, since the days when Caldwell Freight was just a single rusted truck and a dream. If you needed a contract reviewed, you hired a regular lawyer. If you needed an empire dismantled overnight, you called Victor Cross. The phone rang only twice before his sharp, gravelly voice snapped through the speaker, demanding to know who was foolish enough to interrupt his evening. I did not waste time with apologies or polite introductions. I simply spoke my name and told him that my own family was currently attempting a hostile permanent takeover of my life. I gave him the address of the secure loft and told him to drop whatever he was doing. Victor did not ask a single question. He merely grunted his acknowledgement and hung up the phone. 20 minutes later, the private elevator chimed. The metal doors slid open, and Victor stepped directly into the loft. He looked exactly the same as he did 30 years ago, a tall, gaunt man with slicked-back silver hair and eyes as cold and calculating as a winter storm. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, completely unbothered by the freezing rain outside. He carried a battered leather briefcase that held the secrets to half the corporate boardrooms in the Midwest. He did not offer a handshake. He did not ask how I was feeling. He simply walked to the head of the glass conference table, dropped his briefcase onto the surface, and demanded that I give him the exact, unvarnished facts. I stood across from him and laid out the entire sickening timeline. I kept my voice devoid of emotion, presenting the betrayal like a forensic audit. I detailed the humiliating scene at the restaurant lobby, the false claims of severe dementia, and my deliberate tactical submission when I crashed the private dining room. I described the 3 dangerous men sitting at the table, emphasizing the jagged scars, the faded tattoos, and the incredibly predatory demeanor that marked them as high-level cartel enforcers. I told Victor about the Richard Mille watch wrapped around the wrist of Derek, an impossible purchase for a man on a standard salary. Then I explained the dropped fork. I told him how I had crouched beneath the mahogany table and read the bold, undeniable headings on the manila folders Derek had tried to hide. Full medical conservatorship. Asset liquidation. A flawless, completely unauthorized forgery of my personal signature resting at the bottom of the visible page. The jaw of Victor tightened slightly, the only physical indication that he was processing the sheer scale of the deception. I gestured toward the corner of the room, introducing Jason. I explained how my chief operating officer had systematically framed and terminated my senior information technology auditor to cover up a massive, unexplained hemorrhaging of our primary corporate funds. Jason stepped away from the computer monitors, confirming my account. He provided Victor with a rapid, highly technical breakdown of the phantom offshore accounts and the complex routing systems Derek had implemented to siphon millions of dollars under the radar. Victor listened in absolute silence, his eyes darting between me and Jason, assembling the fragmented pieces into a terrifyingly clear picture. When Jason finished speaking, Victor let out a slow, measured breath. He opened his briefcase, pulling out a blank pad and placing a gold pen parallel to the paper. He looked directly at me, his expression grim and utterly devoid of pity. He told me that Melissa and Derek were not just planning to steal my company. They were planning to erase my entire legal existence. Victor explained the precise, brutal mechanics of the trap they had constructed. He said a standard corporate coup takes months of boardroom maneuvering, shareholder votes, and endless litigation. But a full medical conservatorship bypasses all of that completely. By claiming I suffered from violent late-stage dementia and backing it up with heavily fabricated medical records and forged signatures, Melissa was positioning herself as my absolute legal guardian. Victor stated that once a judge signed that conservatorship order, I would lose all fundamental human rights. I would not be able to sign a contract, access a bank account, or even hire a lawyer to defend myself. I would legally become a ghost. Victor leaned over the glass table, his voice dropping to an intense, urgent pitch. He outlined their exact timeline. He said Melissa would arrive at my home at exactly 8 in the morning, accompanied by private medical contractors and local law enforcement. They would drag me out of my house under the guise of an emergency mental health crisis. Once I was securely locked away in a private psychiatric ward, they would immediately execute the asset liquidation documents. The cartel men would use those forged papers to rapidly dismantle Caldwell Freight, selling off our warehouses, trucks, and shipping routes to shell companies they controlled. My empire would be liquidated, leaving me trapped in a medicated stupor. 10 hours remained. We had to counterattack. The large digital clock on the cold brick wall of the loft glowed a vibrant crimson, displaying exactly 11 o'clock at night. The freezing storm outside raged relentlessly, throwing heavy, unforgiving sheets of freezing rain against the thick floor-to-ceiling windows. Inside, the atmosphere crackled with a frantic, desperate energy. Victor Cross sat at the glass conference table, his gold pen flying across legal pads as he drafted emergency motions. Jason sat at the primary computer terminal, the glow of the monitors reflecting off his glasses. I stood directly behind him, resting my heavy hand on his chair, watching the screens with steady focus. I asked Jason how we were going to get inside. I knew our corporate network was protected by state-of-the-art, multi-layered cybersecurity. Jason did not look away from his glowing monitors. He cracked his knuckles, a sharp, sudden sound in the quiet room, and began typing with incredible speed. He told me that when Derek fired him 3 months ago, he had known something was wrong. Before Jason had locked his workstation and walked into that fatal meeting, he quickly embedded a tiny, completely invisible string of code deep within the automated maintenance protocols of the primary server. It was a ghost key, a phantom entry point. It was a digital backdoor designed to allow him administrative access for emergency diagnostics, completely bypassing the main heavy firewalls. Jason hit the enter key with a decisive strike. The black screens flooded with cascading lines of white text. He was in. He had bypassed the outer hardened perimeter of the Caldwell Freight network. But we desperately needed access to Derek's private, heavily partitioned server. We needed the hidden files where he kept his communications with the cartel. Jason navigated through the internal directories, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He explained that Derek had isolated his personal drives, wrapping them in heavy encryption layers. Jason warned us that breaking into that specific isolated partition was going to be incredibly loud. It was a heavy digital battering ram. He asked me for permission to proceed. I looked at Victor, who gave a sharp affirmative nod. I told Jason to tear the door down. Jason executed the override command. For a moment, the room was completely silent, save for the rhythmic tapping of the rain against the glass. Then the entire primary monitor flashed a brilliant, blinding, aggressive red. A loud synthetic warning chime echoed from the computer speakers. Jason swore softly, his hands instantly returning to the keyboard, moving even faster than before. He told us that Derek had installed military-grade reactive countermeasures. The system had detected our unauthorized entry. A silent alarm had just been triggered on Derek's personal devices, and a trace program was actively hunting our connection. Worse than that, an automated wipe protocol had initiated. The server was trying to delete the very files we were trying to steal. We were entirely out of time. Jason shouted that we had less than 5 minutes before the system completely locked us out and initiated a total irrecoverable hard drive purge. The tension in the loft became absolutely suffocating. The ticking clock hung over us like an executioner's blade. Victor slammed his pen down and rushed over to stand beside me, his cold eyes locked onto the flashing red warnings on the screen. He told Jason that he needed the offshore routing numbers immediately. He explained that drafting a counter-injunction to stop the medical conservatorship was useless if the cartel managed to liquidate the shipping assets by dawn. Victor needed the exact specific bank accounts where Derek was hiding the stolen funds so he could file an emergency federal freeze order the moment the courthouse opened. Jason nodded frantically, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. He opened 3 different terminal windows, simultaneously fighting a chaotic, desperate battle against the automated security programs. He typed strings of commands to distract the trace program, creating fake digital pathways to buy himself precious seconds. He told us the firewall was incredibly dense, adapting to his attacks, attempting to sever our connection entirely. I stood motionless, watching the young man fight for my legacy. I felt completely useless in this digital war zone, a man of concrete and steel, trapped in a completely foreign world of code and algorithms. But I knew how to command. I placed my hands firmly on Jason's shoulders, gripping them with steady, grounding strength. I spoke in a calm, authoritative voice, cutting through his rising panic. I told him to breathe. I told him he was smarter than any machine and better than any criminal. I commanded him to find the money. Jason took a sharp, deep breath. His shoulders relaxed slightly under my hands. His focus narrowed to a terrifying point. He stopped fighting the firewall directly. Instead, he slipped sideways, routing his search through the internal email archives of the chief operating officer. He isolated a hidden subfolder disguised as a series of mundane supply chain invoices. He cracked the heavy encryption on the folder. Suddenly, hundreds of digital, highly classified documents flooded the screen. They were not shipping invoices. They were wire transfer receipts. Victor leaned forward, his sharp eyes catching the details instantly. He read the numbers aloud, his voice vibrating with a predatory thrill. He saw transfers of $500,000, $2 million, and $7 million, all routed through a maze of shell companies located in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. The final destination for every single transfer was a holding corporation named after Derek and Melissa. Jason did not stop for a single second. He commanded the system to download the entire folder, creating a secure, mirrored copy on our local hard drive. The progress bar appeared on the screen, a slow, crawling, agonizing blue line fighting against the flashing red countdown of the automated wipe protocol. We needed those files perfectly intact to prove my sanity and their guilt. Sans soin. The system warning blared louder. The trace program was closing in, attempting to sever the address. The download progress agonizingly hit 70%. The wipe protocol initiated its final verification cycle. Victor demanded that Jason work faster, his legal mind already assembling the federal indictments. Jason shouted that he was pushing the bandwidth to its absolute limit, 80%. The angry red warnings multiplied, filling the secondary monitors with error codes. The trace program had located our encrypted server relay. We had seconds left, 90%. I held my breath, the tired muscles in my jaw tight. I thought of my daughter smiling in that private dining room, thinking she had finally defeated me. I thought of the legacy I had built from nothing, currently hanging by a digital thread. 95%. The entire internal network connection began to destabilize, the screen stuttering and glitching wildly. 99%. The screen suddenly went completely black. The connection was brutally, violently severed. The automated security protocol had won. It had locked down the server and shut us out. For a terrible, absolutely agonizing moment, no one spoke a word. The crushing silence in the loft was deafening. Jason slumped back in his chair, his chest heaving as he stared at the dark monitors. Victor stood perfectly still, his fists clenched at his sides. I looked at the black screen, feeling the bitter taste of defeat rising in my throat. Then a small, quiet chime echoed from the local hard drive array resting on the glass table. Jason slowly reached out and tapped the spacebar on his keyboard. The local monitor blinked to life. Sitting squarely in the center of our secure desktop was a massive encrypted file folder. The download had completed a fraction of a millisecond before the connection was severed. We had every single wire transfer, every hidden email, and every piece of communication between Derek and the cartel. Jason looked up at me, a wide, exhausted smile breaking across his face. He pushed his glasses up his nose and softly declared that we had them. Victor let out a rare, sharp bark of laughter. He turned on his heel, striding back toward his legal pads with the energy of a man half his age. He grabbed his gold pen, his eyes burning with absolute righteous fury. He ordered Jason to print every single page of those offshore transfers immediately. He looked at me, a terrifying grin stretching across his gaunt face, and told me that by the time the sun rose over Chicago, Melissa and Derek were going to realize they had picked a fight with the devil himself. The War Council had its ammunition, and the counterattack was officially underway right now today. The heavy brass locks of Victor's battered leather briefcase echoed loudly through the quiet, rain-battered loft. He did not waste a single second celebrating our miraculous digital victory. He moved with the terrifying mechanized precision of a legal assassin who had just been handed the perfect weapon. He pulled out a massive stack of thick, watermarked legal documents, laying them completely flat across the surface of the glass conference table. He looked at me, his cold eyes gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, and told me it was time to build a fortress they could not breach. He explained that Melissa and Derek were relying entirely on the element of surprise. They believed they could waltz into my home at 8 o'clock in the morning, drag me away under a cloud of fabricated medical lies, and instantly activate their forged asset liquidation documents. They assumed my wealth was sitting there exposed and ready for the taking. Victor tapped his gold pen against the thick stack of papers. He told me we were going to completely hollow out their prize before they even arrived. The document sitting in front of me was an irrevocable blind trust. Victor had drafted it on the frantic car ride over, anticipating the exact legal maneuvers a corporate predator would use to steal an empire. He explained the mechanism with surgical clarity. By signing this specific document, I would instantly and irrevocably transfer 80% of my controlling shares in Caldwell Freight and Fleet, along with all my primary personal assets, directly into the protective custody of the trust. Victor would act as the ironclad executor. The beauty of the maneuver was absolutely staggering. If a corrupt judge signed Melissa's forged medical conservatorship tomorrow morning, she would legally gain control over Harrison Caldwell, the person. But Harrison Caldwell, the person, would technically own absolutely nothing. She could not sell my warehouses, she could not liquidate my shipping routes, and she certainly could not hand my legacy over to a cartel because the trust now owned the empire. The forged power of attorney she planned to use would be transformed into a completely useless, legally dead piece of paper. I picked up the gold pen. I held it over the thick parchment, staring at the signature line. For 40 years, I had poured my absolute soul into that company. I had missed birthdays, sacrificed my health, and built a titan of industry from a single rusted truck. Now to save it, I had to give it away. I did not hesitate. I pressed the nib to the paper and signed my name with heavy, deliberate strokes. I signed page after page, authorizing the massive transfer of wealth. With every stroke of the pen, I felt a tremendous, crushing weight lift from my tired shoulders. My legacy was safe, locked behind a legal wall that not even Derek and his violent associates could scale. But defending my assets was only the first phase of the preemptive strike. Now it was time to cut their lifelines. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my secure, heavily encrypted cell phone. It was currently 2 o'clock in the morning, a time when the rest of the world was fast asleep. But when you move hundreds of millions of dollars across international shipping lanes, your banking liaisons do not operate on standard business hours. I bypassed the standard customer service lines and dialed the direct unlisted number for my private wealth management director in Geneva. The phone rang only once before a crisp, alert voice answered. I did not offer any pleasantries. I spoke with the icy, unyielding authority of a man who commanded absolute obedience. I invoked my supreme founder override codes. I instructed the director to immediately permanently freeze every single corporate credit line expense account and discretionary fund attached to Derek and Melissa. I explicitly targeted the black corporate card Derek had so arrogantly placed on the mahogany table at the Sterling Prime just a few hours earlier. I ordered a complete lockdown on the company payroll accounts, demanding that any outgoing wire transfers exceeding $5,000 require my direct verbal authorization. The banking director confirmed the overrides instantly. He did not ask for a reason. He simply executed the commands. Within 60 seconds, the financial guillotine dropped. My daughter and my son-in-law were entirely cut off from the endless river of cash they had been quietly siphoning for months. If they tried to buy so much as a cup of coffee using my company funds, the transaction would be brutally declined. They had no idea they were already financially dead. I ended the call and turned my attention back to Jason. He was sitting at the computer terminal, watching me with a look of profound respect. He had his daughter safely asleep on the sofa, her breathing steady and calm. I told Jason that we had neutralized their legal trap and severed their financial lifeline. Now we needed to lock the physical doors to the kingdom. I asked him if he could access the main security grid for the Caldwell Freight corporate headquarters. Jason smiled, a sharp, vindicated expression lighting up his exhausted face. He cracked his knuckles and turned back to his keyboard. He explained that as the former senior information technology auditor, he had personally designed the security architecture for the downtown high-rise. He typed a rapid sequence of override commands, utilizing the same digital backdoor he had used to steal the cartel evidence. A detailed three-dimensional schematic of the Caldwell Freight building appeared on the glowing monitors. Jason bypassed the administrative protocols and plunged directly into the employee access directory. He located Derek's executive profile and Melissa's legacy board member credentials. With a few swift, decisive keystrokes, Jason entirely revoked their building access. He deleted their keycard authorizations. He scrambled their biometric fingerprint data. He wiped their secure parking garage transponders. He then moved to the internal network, systematically disabling Derek's corporate email accounts, his server permissions, and his administrative overrides. By 3:30 in the morning, the digital purge was absolutely complete. Derek, the man who thought he was a criminal mastermind, was now locked out of the very building he planned to steal. If he tried to walk through the glass doors of my company later that morning, the automated security turnstiles would flash red, and the security guards would treat him exactly like a trespassing stranger. He was a ghost in the machine. We spent the remaining hours in a tense, focused silence. Victor meticulously organized the printed stacks of offshore wire transfers, preparing the massive evidence files he would hand-deliver to the federal authorities. Jason monitored the company servers, ensuring Derek did not trigger any secondary alarms. I sat in the corner of the loft watching the violent rainstorm slowly begin to break. The heavy black clouds gave way to a bruised purple dawn, casting a cold, pale light across the Chicago skyline. At exactly 7 o'clock in the morning, I stood up and walked over to the glass conference table. I smoothed my damp jacket, feeling the exhaustion deep in my bones, but completely ignoring it. My mind was sharp, clear, and perfectly focused on the upcoming battle. I looked at Victor and Jason, two men who had stood by me in the darkest, most dangerous hours of my entire life. I thanked them quietly, knowing that words could never fully express my immense gratitude. I checked my watch. The hands moved steadily toward 8 o'clock. In exactly 1 hour, my daughter Melissa would arrive at my front door with a fake medical diagnosis and a team of men ready to drag me away. She expected to find a confused, helpless old man waiting to be completely destroyed. She expected an easy, pathetic victory. I took a deep breath, letting the cold, hard reality of what I had to do settle into my chest. I turned to Victor and told him to gather the evidence. I told Jason to wake his little girl and prepare to leave the secure loft. We were not going to hide in the shadows any longer. We had stripped them of their legal weapons, their stolen money, and their access to my empire. Now it was time to face them in the light of day. I looked out over the waking city, ready to walk straight back into the jaws of the trap they had set. But this time I held the trigger. Just as I turned away from the window, fully prepared to walk out and face my daughter's orchestrated ambush, Victor slammed his heavy hand flat against the glass conference table. The sharp sound cracked like a whip in the quiet, tense air of the loft. He commanded us to stop exactly where we were. He pointed a long, bony finger at Jason, instructing him to get back to the primary computer terminal immediately. While I had been executing the financial lockdowns with my bankers in Geneva, Victor had been meticulously combing through the final batch of decrypted folders we had extracted from Derek's hidden partition during the midnight hack. He told me that the picture we had was incomplete, and that the truth sitting on the hard drive was infinitely worse than mere corporate greed. I walked back to the table feeling the heavy exhaustion in my bones temporarily vanish, replaced entirely by a surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. Jason rushed back to the keyboard, his fingers flying as he rapidly pulled up the specific directory Victor indicated. I walked over, standing firmly between them, staring down at the glowing monitors. The screen filled with endless rows of ledgers, but these were not standard corporate accounting sheets or offshore banking statements. They were underground markers. I squinted at the numbers, trying to make sense of the erratic, massive cash flows detailing payments to entirely untraceable entities. Victor traced his gold pen along a column of dates stretching back over a year and a half. He explained that Derek had not just been stealing to buy expensive watches or fund a luxurious lifestyle for Melissa. He had a severe, catastrophic, and violently destructive addiction. The ledgers detailed astronomical losses in illicit underground gambling rings scattered across the country. There were records of high-stakes poker games, unregulated sports betting, and shady offshore cryptocurrency casinos. The financial losses had compounded week after week, spiraling completely out of his control. Victor highlighted the final deficit at the bottom of the spreadsheet. Derek owed exactly $25 million, but he did not owe this staggering amount of money to a standard bookie or a simple loan shark. Jason opened an encrypted email chain linked directly to the financial ledgers. The messages were filled with thinly veiled threats, terrifying photographs of Derek's home, and incredibly violent ultimatums. They originated from a shadow corporation that Victor instantly recognized from his decades of navigating the darkest corners of corporate law. He looked up at me, his gaunt face paler than I had ever seen it. He explained that this specific shell company was a known, heavily documented front for one of the most ruthless, heavily armed drug syndicates operating out of Chicago. The three men I had faced in the private dining room at the Sterling Prime just hours earlier were not independent financial fixers or rogue investors. They were high-ranking cartel enforcers sent specifically to collect a massive blood debt. The puzzle pieces fell into a horrifying, seamless alignment. $25 million was not an amount Derek could simply siphon from Caldwell Freight without triggering massive federal audits, no matter how clever his routing software was. The cartel knew this perfectly well. They did not want liquid cash. They wanted untraceable infrastructure. Jason clicked open the final document hidden deep within the encrypted folder. It was a complete, highly detailed operational blueprint of my entire logistics network. Derek had meticulously mapped out our massive Southside distribution hub. He had specifically highlighted the security camera blind spots, the automated loading bays, and the specific interstate trucking routes that completely bypassed federal way stations. He was handing over the literal keys to my empire. The cartel planned to use Caldwell Freight and Fleet as a massive, entirely untraceable conduit for smuggling heavy narcotics and illegal weapons across the Midwest. They were going to pack their poison into my trucks, hiding it securely beneath legitimate commercial cargo. To facilitate an operation of this magnitude without detection, Derek needed absolute, unquestioned control of the company. He needed the founder completely removed from the equation. This was the exact reason why Melissa was coming to my house this morning, to declare me legally incompetent. If I was successfully locked away in a secure psychiatric ward, Derek, acting as the chief operating officer and wielding my forged power of attorney, could grant the cartel unlimited, unsupervised access to my warehouses. If the federal authorities eventually raided the facilities and discovered the drugs, the digital paper trail would lead directly back to the incapacitated founder. Derek and Melissa would walk away completely clean. The cartel would have its smuggling route firmly established, and I would spend the rest of my natural life dying slowly in a federal prison hospital branded as a senile criminal mastermind. I stared at the monitors, a profound, icy silence enveloping my entire body. My own daughter. The little girl I had raised. I had paid for her college education, walked her proudly down the aisle, and bought the very home she slept in. In return, she was actively participating in a conspiracy that would not just steal my wealth, but completely frame me for federal crimes and leave me to rot in a cage. She was willing to sell my life's work to violent drug runners just to save her husband's pathetic skin. The sheer, unfathomable evil of their comprehensive plan completely extinguished whatever tiny lingering spark of paternal hesitation remained in my heart. Victor quickly began compiling this new, highly explosive evidence into a separate classified dossier. He stated that this was no longer just a straightforward case of elder abuse or corporate fraud. This was a massive federal racketeering conspiracy. He instructed me to proceed with our original plan to return to my home and face Melissa and her medical team, but with a brand new directive. I was to stall them, to play the helpless victim, and keep them firmly anchored in my living room, while Victor contacted his specialized liaisons within the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We were going to let them spring their trap, only to realize the jaws were closing tightly around their own necks. Jason quickly powered down the main terminal, executing a precise scrubbing protocol to erase our digital footprint from the loft's servers. He scooped his sleeping daughter into his arms, carrying her gently against his shoulder. I looked at this brave young man, who had risked his life to stop a massive cartel operation he did not even fully understand until this very moment. I told him to take the secure vehicle Victor had arranged and go directly to the safe house, staying completely out of sight until the federal agents officially contacted him. I walked to the heavy steel door, pulling my collar up against the freezing, absolutely bitter cold morning air, blowing off the dark, freezing, icy lake. I stepped out of the loft, completely ready for war. I knew when Melissa arrived to execute her flawless, heavily calculated betrayal, she would quickly find out that the helpless old man she was hunting had already burned her entire world to the ground. I stood at the heavy steel door of the secure loft, my hand resting firmly on the cold brass handle. I was completely prepared to walk out into the freezing Chicago dawn and face my daughter. I had accepted the painful reality of her betrayal. I was ready to let her spring her pathetic, forged medical ambush in my living room, knowing Victor and Jason had secured the evidence to destroy her conspiracy. Before I could step into the hallway, the commanding voice of Victor Cross cut through the quiet air. His tone possessed a terrifying urgency that instantly froze my blood. He ordered me to return to the glass conference table right this instant. I turned around, my heavy boots thudding against the hardwood floor. Victor was standing rigidly over Jason, his gaunt face illuminated by the harsh white glow of the computer monitors. His expression was a look of absolute, unadulterated disgust. I walked back to the center of the room, feeling the adrenaline surging through my chest once again. Jason was typing furiously, his eyes darting across a newly decrypted folder that he had just managed to isolate from the massive data dump. Victor pointed his solid gold pen at a single highlighted line of financial code on the primary screen. He told me that they had been so entirely focused on the $25 million cartel debt and the massive corporate embezzlement that they had almost missed a secondary, heavily concealed offshore routing path. Victor explained that Derek had not initiated this specific transfer. The digital signature on this transaction belonged exclusively to Melissa. She had utilized a separate private shell company to authorize an isolated wire transfer of exactly $3 million. The money had been moved just 48 hours ago, bouncing rapidly through 3 different international holding accounts before landing in a completely untraceable domestic trust. I stared at the staggering number on the screen, my mind struggling to process this new development. I asked Victor who she was paying. I assumed she was perhaps funneling a secondary payment to the cartel, attempting to buy herself some personal leverage or protection. Victor shook his head slowly, his eyes burning with a cold, intense fury. He stated that this money had absolutely nothing to do with underground gambling debts or illegal smuggling routes. This was a highly targeted, incredibly specific bribe. Victor tapped the glass screen, tracing the final destination of the massive sum. The trust account belonged to a notoriously corrupt private psychiatrist who operated a highly secluded maximum security mental health facility located entirely out of state, hundreds of miles away from my jurisdiction and my corporate connections. The full, terrifying scope of my daughter's malice began to crystallize in my mind. Victor outlined the grim reality of the medical trap she had built. The $3 million bribe was a direct payment to guarantee that this specific physician would sign the falsified, heavily fabricated psychological evaluation without conducting a single legitimate medical examination. This doctor was being paid to legally rubber stamp my total cognitive destruction. He was the vital corrupt key that would grant Melissa the absolute power of the full medical conservatorship. He would look a judge in the eye and swear on his medical license that Harrison Caldwell was a violent, severely demented danger to himself and others, actively requiring immediate permanent institutionalization. I felt a cold sweat break out across the back of my neck. Jason suddenly held up his hand, signaling for absolute silence. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He told us that he had found an encrypted audio file physically attached to the digital transaction record. It was a secure voice memo that Melissa had recorded and sent directly to Derek from her personal device, explicitly detailing the final stages of her horrific plan. Jason looked at me, his young face pale with genuine horror, asking if I was completely sure I wanted to hear it. I did not blink. I did not look away. I gave him a firm single nod, demanding that he play the recording immediately. Jason hit the spacebar. The loft was instantly filled with the crisp, unmistakable sound of my daughter's voice. It was not the panicked, tearful tone she had used in the private dining room when she was trying to manipulate me. It was not the sweet, doting voice she used to perform for her wealthy friends. This voice was pure, unfiltered venom. It was cold, incredibly calculating, and completely devoid of human empathy. I stood perfectly still, listening as the child I had carried on my shoulders systematically plotted my permanent torture. In the recording, Melissa spoke to Derek with a chilling, businesslike efficiency. She explicitly confirmed that the massive $3 million wire transfer to the private facility had successfully cleared. She assured her husband that the corrupt doctor was completely locked in and perfectly ready to process my intake the moment the medical transport team dragged me through their heavily fortified doors. Then she uttered a sequence of words that permanently shattered my soul into a million jagged pieces. Her voice dripped with arrogant, cruel satisfaction. She clearly stated that once the old man is strapped down in the psychiatric ward tomorrow, he will rot there. I closed my eyes, the sheer malice of her words echoing through the quiet loft. The recording continued, growing even more vicious. Melissa laughed, a soft, entirely humorless laugh. She told Derek that she had intentionally chosen the absolute worst, most heavily isolated facility out of state, so nobody will ever visit him. She bragged about the specific instructions she had given to the medical staff. She had explicitly ordered them to keep me heavily sedated, completely stripping me of my dignity, my memories, and my basic human functions. She wanted me chemically restrained, trapped in a permanent, agonizing fog, entirely unable to communicate with the outside world. She was actively orchestrating my psychological and physical demise. She wanted me erased from the face of the earth, buried alive in a sterile white room, forgotten and chemically silenced forever. The audio file ended with a sharp click, the heavy silence returned to the loft. Jason stared at his keyboard, unable to meet my gaze, disturbed by the evil he had just uncovered. Victor stood motionless, waiting for my reaction. I opened my eyes. I did not shed a single tear. The profound sorrow evaporated, replaced by absolute certainty. The person arriving at my home in a few hours was a predator who sought to destroy my life without hesitation. I looked at Victor, my voice ringing out with authority. I instructed him to upload the audio to the federal server immediately. I told Jason to lock the drives. I turned my back to the monitors and walked toward the door. I was Harrison Caldwell, the undisputed founder of Caldwell Freight and Fleet, and I was finally going home to completely crush the arrogant monsters trying to steal my life. The storm had broken, leaving behind a bitter and freezing Chicago morning. I drove back toward my estate in Lincoln Park, the heavy silence of the car offering a stark contrast to the chaotic battlefield my life had just become. The audio recording of my daughter played repeatedly in my mind. Her voice, so cold and stripped of humanity, no longer caused me pain. The father who had loved her, the man who had bought her a fairy tale life, died the exact moment she laughed about strapping me down in a forgotten ward. In his place was a man who had built a corporate empire with ruthless efficiency. The sorrow had burned away entirely, leaving nothing but absolute ice. My vision was sharper than it had been in decades. I was not going to be a victim. I was going to be the architect of their ruin. Victor and Jason followed closely behind me in a separate vehicle. When we arrived at my dark, silent mansion, we immediately moved into the grand study. The mahogany walls, usually a source of comfort, now felt like the perimeter of a war room. Victor unpacked his leather briefcase across my desk, spreading out the final batch of intercepted communications Jason had pulled from the server. He pointed his gold pen at a heavily encrypted contract executed between Melissa and the corrupt psychiatrist. The details were incredibly precise and sickeningly thorough. Victor looked at me, his sharp eyes filled with a grim warning, and laid out the exact timeline of my scheduled destruction. At precisely 8 o'clock this morning, a private rogue medical extraction team was going to breach my front doors. Melissa had hired a specialized unit men who usually operated in the shadows of the medical industry, tasked with handling supposedly violent and non-compliant patients. Victor read from the digital manifest. The team consisted of 4 heavily built orderlies and 1 rogue nurse carrying a powerful, fast-acting chemical sedative. Their explicit instructions were to bypass any verbal negotiation. The moment they laid eyes on me, they were to forcibly inject me with a massive dose of haloperidol, instantly rendering me unconscious and entirely compliant. Once I was chemically paralyzed, they would strap me into a specialized medical transport vehicle parked discreetly in the alleyway. The contract detailed the route they would take, deliberately avoiding major highways to prevent any potential interference. They were transporting me to a maximum security psychiatric facility located 300 miles across state lines deep into the remote countryside. It was a private, unregulated nightmare built for the convenience of wealthy families who wanted problematic relatives permanently erased from society. Victor explained that once the iron doors of that facility closed behind me, the heavily bribed doctor would officially process my intake. My cell phone, my identification, and my legal rights would be confiscated. I would be locked in a solitary windowless room, kept completely submerged in a heavy pharmacological fog for the rest of my natural life. Victor closed the file, the heavy thud echoing in the quiet study. He checked his polished silver watch. It was currently 5:30 in the morning. We had exactly 2.5 hours before the extraction team arrived to drag me into a living death. Victor leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. He spoke with urgent, pragmatic authority. He told me that we had secured the evidence we needed to dismantle the cartel operation and expose the embezzlement, but staying in the house was a massive, unnecessary risk. He strongly advised that we pack my essential documents, slip out through the private service exit, and drive directly to the federal courthouse downtown. We could file the emergency injunctions from the safety of a federal building surrounded by armed marshals. He wanted me to run. I walked over to the large bay window looking out at the meticulously manicured lawns of my estate. The sky was beginning to turn a pale, bruised purple. I listened to the steady, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock standing in the corner of the room. I felt the smooth, polished wood of the windowsill under my hands. I thought about the 40 years of relentless sacrifice I had poured into my family and my company. I thought about Derek sitting in his tailored suit, plotting to sell my legacy to violent drug runners. I thought about Melissa laughing as she paid mercenaries to turn my brain into a chemical wasteland. I turned back to face Victor. I spoke in a quiet, unwavering voice that left absolutely no room for debate. I told him I was not going to run. I was not going to sneak out the back door of my own home like a frightened animal. I had spent my entire life standing my ground, fighting off corporate raiders, vicious competitors, and economic collapses. I was certainly not going to surrender my sanctuary to a group of hired thugs and a treacherous daughter. I declared that if they wanted to take my life, they were going to have to walk through my front door and try to take it while looking me directly in the eyes. Victor stared at me for a long moment. He saw the absolute unbreakable resolve settling over my features. A slow, terrifying smile crept across his gaunt face. He nodded once, a gesture of profound respect, and reached into his coat to pull out his encrypted mobile phone. He told me that if we were going to stay and fight on my home turf, we were going to execute a flawless counter-ambush. While I held the line in the study, Victor was going to coordinate a massive, devastating response with his federal contacts. We were going to let Melissa spring her trap, allowing her to commit fully to the crime, and then we were going to drop the anvil on her neck. The next 2 hours passed with an intense, calculated silence. Jason sat in the corner monitoring the external security cameras feeding into his laptop, watching the perimeter of the estate with hawk-like vigilance. Victor paced the length of the study, making rapid, hushed phone calls to federal prosecutors, utilizing decades of accumulated favors to position heavily armed tactical units, completely out of sight, just blocks away from my property. I sat behind my heavy mahogany desk, wearing my finest tailored suit, the very armor I wore when dismantling rival corporations. I felt an incredible icy calm wash over my entire being. The fear was completely gone. The sorrow was entirely erased. Only the mission remained. The grandfather clock chimed 7:30. 30 minutes left. I instructed Jason to unlock the heavy iron gates at the front of the driveway. I wanted to roll out the red carpet for them. I wanted them to drive right up to the front steps without a single shred of resistance. I wanted Melissa to feel the thrilling, intoxicating rush of complete victory right up until the exact second I tore it away from her. The wait was finally over. The true war for my absolute survival was about to begin right now. To understand the sheer crushing magnitude of the trap waiting for my daughter, you have to understand exactly what Victor Cross had been orchestrating in the shadows while the city slept. The calm I felt at 7:30 was not merely the bravado of an angry father. It was the absolute certainty of a man who held a royal flush. The foundation of my counterattack had been poured hours earlier, precisely at 3 in the morning, when Victor unleashed the full terrifying weight of his legal and political connections. While Jason was furiously locking down the digital perimeters and securing the hard drives in the loft, Victor had stepped into a quiet corner with his encrypted satellite phone and began pulling his highest-level favors. He did not call local precincts or desk sergeants. He went directly to the absolute top of the federal food chain. His first call was to a sitting federal judge, a man Victor had successfully defended during a highly sensitive, potentially career-ending Senate confirmation hearing over a decade ago. Victor bypassed all standard judicial protocols and woke the judge from a deep sleep at 3 in the morning. He did not apologize for the intrusion. He simply stated that a massive multi-million-dollar interstate money laundering operation tied directly to the Chicago drug cartel was currently unfolding, and the perpetrators were about to commit a felony kidnapping to cover their tracks. Victor transmitted the encrypted dossier Jason had compiled containing the offshore wire transfers, the intercepted emails, and the complete operational blueprints Derek had prepared for the cartel. The judge reviewed the files in the dead of night and immediately grasped the catastrophic severity of the situation. Within 20 minutes, the judge signed a stack of emergency, highly classified federal warrants, authorizing immediate arrest and asset seizure for Derek, Melissa, and their entire network of conspirators. With the federal warrants securely digitally signed and validated, Victor made his second critical move. He contacted the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Unit. This was not a cold call. Victor had fed them vital high-level corporate informants for years, building a relationship based on mutual ruthless efficiency. He laid out the exact parameters of the cartel smuggling operation Derek had designed using the Caldwell Freight Logistics Network. He provided the direct routing numbers of the $25 million gambling debt and the subsequent corporate embezzlement used to appease the violent syndicate. The FBI director immediately recognized the unprecedented value of the intelligence. They had been trying to dismantle this specific cartel faction for 5 years without success. Victor handed them the entire organizational structure on a silver platter. In exchange, Victor demanded absolute tactical control over the morning raid. He insisted that the federal agents stage themselves discreetly around the perimeter of my estate, remaining completely invisible until Melissa and her rogue extraction team had fully committed to the ambush inside my home. The final, most crucial piece of the countermeasure required dismantling the forged medical conservatorship. The entire foundation of the plan of my daughter relied on presenting me to the courts as a severely demented, chemically subdued invalid. To neutralize this threat permanently, Victor needed an unimpeachable medical authority. At 4 a.m, he pulled his ultimate favor. He contacted the chief state medical examiner, a highly decorated, fiercely independent neurologist whose medical testimony was considered absolute gospel in the state Supreme Court. Victor arranged for the examiner to secretly arrive at my estate through the heavily wooded back service road long before the morning sun even rose. The examiner had arrived at my home just after 6 a.m. We sat together in my quiet mahogany study while the storm raged outside. For over an hour, he conducted an incredibly rigorous, legally bulletproof cognitive and psychological evaluation. He asked me complex analytical questions, tested my short-term and long-term memory, and evaluated my executive reasoning skills. When the examination was finally complete, the examiner signed a sworn, legally binding affidavit declaring that my mental faculties were not only completely intact, but operating at a highly sophisticated, exceptionally sharp level. He explicitly noted that any previous documentation claiming otherwise was entirely fabricated and medically impossible. This document was the ultimate shield. It rendered the corrupt psychiatric evaluation Melissa had purchased for $3 million completely and utterly useless. The state medical examiner then quietly took a seat in the adjoining library, sipping a cup of black coffee, perfectly prepared to step forward and serve as an expert federal witness the moment the trap was sprung. Now, as the grandfather clock ticked steadily toward 8 a.m, the invisible net was pulled agonizingly tight. I stood by the bay window of the study, adjusting the cuffs of my suit, feeling the smooth, expensive fabric against my wrists. Outside, the freezing rain had slowed to a miserable, icy drizzle. The heavy iron gates at the end of my winding driveway stood wide open, a silent, inviting invitation for the predators to enter. Jason sat silently at my desk, his fingers hovering over the keyboard of his laptop. He had successfully tapped into the neighborhood traffic cameras, monitoring the long, winding residential street leading to my estate. He kept his voice low, steady, and entirely professional. He informed me that 2 vehicles had just turned onto the main avenue. The first was a sleek, black luxury sedan, the exact make and model Derek proudly drove to the corporate office every day. The second vehicle was a large, unmarked white transport van with heavily tinted windows and reinforced steel plating along the side panels. This was the rogue medical extraction team. The mercenaries Melissa had hired to erase my existence. They crept slowly up the wet pavement, completely unaware of the massive federal apparatus waiting in the shadows. They did not see the 3 unmarked federal surveillance vehicles parked discreetly behind the dense oak trees across the street. They did not see the tactical agents holding their positions in the neighboring empty lot, their weapons ready and their radios silent. Melissa and Derek believed they were the absolute masters of the board. They believed they were about to execute a flawless surgical strike against a helpless old man. I watched the black sedan pull through the open iron gates, its tires crunching softly against the wet gravel. The white transport van followed closely behind, moving like a pale ghost in the early morning light. They parked directly in front of the grand marble steps of my entryway. I felt my heart steady into a slow, powerful rhythm. The pain of the betrayal had been completely replaced by the cold, mechanical precision of the impending execution. I turned away from the window and looked at Victor. He stood by the fireplace holding his leather briefcase, his eyes locked onto the solid oak doors of the study. He gave me a single grim nod. The cavalry was not just coming. The cavalry was already here, hiding perfectly in plain sight, waiting for my command. I walked to the center of the room, squared my shoulders, and waited for my daughter. I stood in the exact center of the room for a long moment, listening to the heavy engines of the transport van idling just beyond my front doors. The violent storm outside had finally broken, leaving behind a cold, gray morning that matched the absolute chill in my veins. Victor and the medical examiner had silently retreated into the adjoining library, leaving me completely alone in the vast expanse of my mahogany study. I walked slowly toward the massive leather armchair, positioned behind my desk. The rich, familiar scent of old paper leather and wood polish grounded me. I picked up a porcelain cup of black coffee from the edge of the desk. The ceramic was still incredibly warm against my palm. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The bitter, dark liquid burned slightly as it went down, a sharp reminder that I was completely awake, entirely lucid, and perfectly prepared for the brutal confrontation ahead. I sat down heavily in the armchair, the thick leather groaning softly beneath my weight. I rested the coffee cup on the polished wooden coaster and turned my attention to the silver-framed photograph resting precisely in the center of my desk. It was a picture of my late wife, Eleanor. The photograph had been taken nearly 30 years ago during a summer vacation in the mountains. She was smiling brightly at the camera, her hair blowing wildly in the wind, holding a very young Melissa in her arms. The little girl in the picture was laughing, clutching a small stuffed bear, looking at her mother with a look of absolute pure adoration. I stared at the face of that innocent child, trying to reconcile the bright, happy girl in the photograph with the cold, calculating predator currently standing on my front porch. The medical evaluation from the state examiner rested in a crisp white folder right next to the silver frame. The official, government-stamped document certified with absolute legal certainty that my cognitive functions were flawless. It proved that my memory was sharp, my reasoning was completely intact, and my mind was functioning with the high-level strategic precision of a seasoned corporate founder. The diagnosis of severe dementia that Melissa had purchased for $3 million was now nothing more than a piece of heavily fabricated garbage. I placed my hand flat over the white folder, feeling the smooth texture of the expensive paper. It was my shield. It was the undeniable proof of my sanity and the absolute proof of her treacherous, calculated malice. I looked back at the photograph of Eleanor. A profound, aching sorrow washed over me, but it was not for myself. It was for the woman I had loved and the child we had raised together. I realized in that quiet, solitary moment that I had spent the last 10 years making endless excuses for my daughter. I had attributed her selfishness to youth. I had blamed her arrogance on the wealth I had provided. I had convinced myself that beneath the designer clothes and the sharp, cruel comments, the little girl from the photograph still existed. I had believed that family bonds could survive any amount of greed or entitlement. I had been completely tragically wrong. The woman standing outside my door was not my daughter. She was merely a corporate raider wearing the face of my child. She had methodically planned my absolute destruction. She had hired violent cartel enforcers, forged complex legal documents, and paid a corrupt doctor to completely erase my existence. She wanted to lock me in a sterile, windowless room pumped full of heavy chemical sedatives while she sold my entire life legacy to a violent drug syndicate. She had traded my life for $25 million to cover the gambling debts of her treacherous husband. There was no misunderstanding. There was no miscommunication. There was only pure, unadulterated evil. I picked up the black coffee again and took another slow sip. The warmth of the liquid contrasted sharply with the freezing ice running through my chest. I felt a strange, profound sense of liberation settling over my shoulders. The heavy burden of parental guilt was completely gone. I no longer had to protect her. I no longer had to shield her from the harsh, unforgiving realities of the world. By choosing to step into the criminal underworld, by choosing to align herself with a ruthless cartel and attempt to steal my empire, Melissa had voluntarily removed herself from my protection. She had stepped onto the battlefield as a combatant, and I was going to treat her exactly like an enemy force attempting a hostile takeover. The silence in the grand study was absolute, broken only by the steady rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock standing in the corner. Each swing of the heavy brass pendulum echoed loudly, marking the final seconds of the old world. I looked around the room, taking in the details of the sanctuary I had built. The floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, the large, intricate globe standing near the window, the heavy velvet curtains pulled back to reveal the bleak gray morning. I had fought hundreds of vicious corporate battles from this very room. I had dismantled rival logistics companies, negotiated massive international shipping contracts, and built Caldwell Freight into an absolute titan of American industry. But this was the most important battle of my entire life. I heard the distinct heavy sound of boots stepping onto the front marble porch. The muffled voices of the rogue extraction team filtered through the thick walls. They were checking their equipment, preparing the heavy chemical sedatives, and getting ready to execute the forced institutionalization. I imagined Derek standing behind them, nervously checking his stolen luxury watch, eager to get his hands on the forged asset liquidation documents. I imagined Melissa cold and detached, waiting for the men to drag her father away so she could claim her bloody inheritance. I leaned back in the large leather armchair, steepling my fingers together in my lap. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit. My mind was completely clear. My heart was perfectly steady. The federal agents were holding their invisible perimeter outside, waiting for the signal. Victor and the medical examiner were waiting silently in the adjacent library, holding the legal ammunition that would completely destroy the conspiracy. Everything was perfectly aligned. The snare was set. I stared directly at the heavy, solid oak doors of the study. I watched the ornate brass handle. I knew that in a few seconds that handle was going to turn. The doors were going to swing open, and the monsters I had inadvertently funded and protected were going to step into my domain. They expected to find a weak, confused old man trembling in fear and ready to be chemically subdued. They expected an incredibly easy, truly pathetic surrender. They had absolutely no idea they were walking straight into a devastating, heavily coordinated federal trap. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the final traces of the father vanish entirely, leaving only the founder. I was finally ready for the wolves to enter the slaughterhouse. The antique grandfather clock in the corner of my study began to chime its deep, resonant tones, echoing through the silent mansion. 1, 2, 3. I counted the heavy strikes, my eyes fixed firmly on the thick oak double doors. As the 8th chime faded into the cold morning air, a tremendous crash shattered the tranquility of the estate. The heavy front doors of my home were violently kicked open, the reinforced hinges groaning under a brutal assault. Heavy boots stomped onto the imported marble floors of the grand foyer, their wet soles squeaking aggressively against the pristine stone. It was the sound of a tactical home invasion, masked as a medical emergency. I remained perfectly still in my leather armchair, the porcelain coffee cup resting warmly in my palm. The hunt had officially breached my walls. From my position in the study, I could hear the immediate frantic coordination of the extraction team. A gruff, commanding voice shouted clear directives, ordering men to fan out and secure the perimeter of the ground floor. They were moving with military precision, clearing rooms rapidly. Then, cutting through the heavy thudding footsteps, came the voice of my daughter. Melissa was putting on the performance of a lifetime. Her tone was artificially pitched high, laced with a meticulously manufactured panic that would have convinced anyone who did not know the absolute blackness of her heart. She was shouting into the empty hallways, projecting her voice so the hired muscle would hear her profound, agonizing sorrow. She cried out into the massive house, shouting that it was for my own good, begging me not to fight the medicine when they found me. She wept openly, her voice echoing up the grand staircase, telling the rogue medical team that her father was deeply confused, highly volatile, and suffering from violent delusions. She instructed them to be firm, but fast, claiming that I posed a severe physical threat to myself and to them. I sat in the dim light of the study, listening to the absolute perfection of her treacherous lie. She was expertly laying the psychological groundwork, ensuring that when the orderlies finally cornered me, they would not hesitate to use overwhelming physical force and administer the chemical sedatives. I heard the heavy footfalls moving rapidly past the formal dining room, bypassing the kitchen, and heading directly toward the private residential wing. Derek was marching right alongside them. I could hear his sharp, arrogant voice directing the lead orderly toward the master bedroom suite. He confidently told the men that the old man rarely left his bed before 9 in the morning, assuring them they would find me vulnerable, groggy, and completely disoriented in my pajamas. The absolute arrogance of his assumption made a cold smile touch my face. They stomped up the carpeted steps, their voices briefly fading as they breached the empty master bedroom. A few seconds later, the chaotic noise halted. A frustrated shout rang out. The large bedroom was completely empty. A sudden sharp silence fell over the massive house as the extraction team realized their primary target was missing from the expected location. The quiet lasted for only a few seconds before the heavy boots began rapidly descending the grand staircase. They were fanning out across the ground floor once again, their movements growing noticeably more frantic. Derek barked an order to check the rear conservatory, his voice losing a fraction of its arrogant certainty. Then a heavy set of footsteps paused directly outside the closed oak doors of my study. A thick gloved hand grasped the ornate brass handle. I folded my hands together and rested them on the pristine surface of my mahogany desk. The heavy oak doors were violently shoved open, slamming hard against the white interior walls. 4 massive, broad-shouldered men spilled into the room, fanning out in a practiced tactical formation. They wore dark navy scrubs that fit tightly across their heavily muscled chests, looking far more like private military contractors than healthcare professionals. 2 of the men held thick leather restraining straps, while the lead orderly gripped a large, terrifyingly long hypodermic needle filled with a viscous, milky white fluid. They burst through the threshold with their muscles tensed, fully expecting to wrestle a thrashing, confused, and terrified elderly man to the carpet. But as they stormed into the center of the study, their aggressive momentum instantly evaporated. They stopped dead in their tracks, their heavy boots skidding to a halt on the Persian rug. The entire extraction team completely froze, staring in absolute, unadulterated bewilderment at the scene before them. I was not cowering in the corner. I was not wearing wrinkled pajamas or staring blankly at the walls in a state of advanced cognitive decline. I was sitting perfectly upright behind my massive desk, dressed in a flawless, custom-tailored charcoal suit, complete with a crisp white shirt and a silk tie. My silver hair was perfectly combed. My posture was rigid and commanding. The state medical examiner certified evaluation sat in a pristine white folder to my left. The silver-framed photograph of Eleanor rested to my right. The room was immaculate, completely devoid of the chaotic disarray they had been paid to expect. I looked at the four massive men with an expression of absolute, terrifying calm. The lead orderly lowered the heavy syringe slightly, his brow furrowing in deep, profound confusion as he processed the utter lack of vulnerability in the room. Derek pushed his way past the broad shoulders of the stationary orderlies, storming into the study with a look of furious impatience. He was holding a thick manila folder, undoubtedly containing the forged medical conservatorship and the fraudulent asset liquidation papers. Melissa followed closely behind him, clutching a crumpled tissue to her face, her eyes squeezed shut, as she prepared to deliver the final act of her weeping daughter routine. Derek stepped into the light of the bay window, opening his mouth to bark a command at the hired muscle, but the words died instantly in his throat. He stopped right next to the lead orderly, his arrogant sneer faltering as his eyes locked onto mine. He looked at my perfectly tailored suit, the steaming cup of black coffee, and the completely unbothered, intensely focused expression on my face. Melissa finally lowered the crumpled tissue from her face, peering around the massive frame of the nearest orderly. Her fake tears vanished the very second she saw me sitting securely behind my desk. The blood drained entirely from her face, leaving her pale and visibly shaken. The carefully constructed illusion of the frail, demented father shattered into 1,000 irreversible pieces before her very eyes. She had paid $3 million for a medical ambush, fully anticipating a messy, desperate struggle. Instead, she was looking at the undisputed founder of Caldwell Freight, ready to completely destroy them. I smiled, breaking the deafening silence, softly telling my daughter that she was entirely out of time. The grand study doors were fully open, exposing the absolute destruction of their meticulously planned betrayal, and the federal agents were already moving rapidly across the green lawns. This was over. Now. Exactly. I reached beneath the thick mahogany edge of my desk and pressed the concealed security button. Instantly, the dim, atmospheric lighting of the grand study vanished. A bank of high-intensity overhead floodlights flared to life, flooding the massive room with a blinding, harsh white illumination. The sudden brilliance caused the four massive orderlies to flinch, raising their free hands to shield their eyes. Derek staggered backward, his arrogant posture completely crumbling under the blinding glare. Melissa let out a short, high-pitched gasp, dropping her crumpled tissue to the floor. The stage was fully illuminated, stripping away all the shadows they had relied upon to execute their treacherous ambush. I remained seated in my leather armchair, perfectly still, watching the terrifying reality of their situation dawn upon their pale faces. Before Derek could utter a single word of protest, the heavy sliding doors of the adjoining library smoothly rolled open. Victor Cross stepped into the blinding light of the study. He did not look like a corporate lawyer. He looked like an executioner. His dark suit was immaculate, and his gaunt face was set in an expression of absolute, terrifying authority. Right beside him walked the chief state medical examiner, a distinguished older man with piercing eyes and an aura of unimpeachable medical credibility. The examiner carried a sleek, black leather portfolio. The sudden appearance of these two highly formidable men caused the rogue medical team to exchange nervous, confused glances. The lead orderly, still gripping the massive syringe filled with haloperidol, took a hesitant step backward, suddenly realizing that this was not the helpless dementia-ridden patient he had been paid to chemically subdue. Victor did not even look at my daughter. He directed his piercing gaze entirely at Derek, his voice cutting through the silent room like a serrated blade. He informed Derek that his $25 million offshore wire transfers had been fully intercepted and immediately flagged by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Victor stated that the temporary shell companies Derek had utilized to embezzle corporate funds from Caldwell Freight were currently being seized by federal prosecutors. Derek opened his mouth, his jaw working silently, but no sound emerged. The thick manila folder containing the forged asset liquidation papers trembled violently in his hands. The heavy sound of tactical boots echoed fiercely in the grand foyer behind them. The federal agents we had watched crossing the green lawns had breached the front of the mansion. A dozen heavily armed agents from the Financial Crimes Unit and the Violent Crimes Task Force poured into the study, their tactical gear rustling sharply. They fanned out with breathtaking speed, forming an impenetrable wall of federal authority around the perimeter of the room. The commanding officer of the unit stepped forward, his hand resting firmly on his holstered weapon. He issued a single deafening command for the rogue medical team to drop the chemical sedatives and raise their hands immediately. The lead orderly looked at the syringe in his hand, then looked at the dozen armed federal agents surrounding him. The decision took less than a second. He dropped the heavy needle. It clattered harmlessly against the polished hardwood floor, the milky white liquid pooling near the edge of the Persian rug. The three other orderlies instantly released their heavy leather restraining straps, raising their hands high into the air, in a gesture of complete, unresisting surrender. Within seconds, federal agents swarmed the four massive men. The harsh metallic clicking of steel handcuffs echoed rapidly through the study, as the mercenaries were forcefully spun around their arms, violently secured behind their backs. The terrifying extraction team that Melissa had hired to erase my existence was neutralized and completely immobilized in less than 30 seconds. The state medical examiner stepped forward, his shoes stepping carefully over the discarded leather straps. He approached Derek, who was completely frozen in a state of catatonic shock. The examiner reached out and firmly snatched the thick manila folder directly from his trembling hands. He opened the folder, his expert eyes scanning the highly fabricated psychiatric evaluation Melissa had purchased for $3 million. A look of profound, genuine medical disgust twisted his features. He read the fraudulent signature of the corrupt out-of-state psychiatrist. He looked at Melissa, his voice dripping with absolute professional contempt. He told her that this document was a pathetic, legally worthless piece of garbage. He stated that the physician who signed it would be stripped of his medical license by noon and facing severe federal charges for medical fraud and attempted kidnapping. With a swift, dramatic motion, the state medical examiner tore the fraudulent evaluation precisely in half. He walked over to the ornate brass wastebasket near my desk and tossed the shredded pieces of paper inside. Then he opened his sleek black leather portfolio and produced the crisp white document he had completed just 2 hours earlier. He held it up high, ensuring that Melissa, Derek, and every federal agent in the room could see the official gold-embossed seal of the State Medical Board. He announced with absolute booming authority that he had personally evaluated Harrison Caldwell this very morning. He declared that I was in a state of perfect, exceptional cognitive health. He certified that my memory, executive function, and analytical reasoning were 100% intact and completely flawless. The examiner stated that any claim of dementia or mental instability was a malicious, verifiable lie designed to facilitate a massive financial crime. The final, inescapable truth crashed down upon my daughter. Her elaborate $3 million medical trap was completely destroyed by a single, unimpeachable piece of paper. Melissa stared at the torn pieces of the forged evaluation in the wastebasket, her breath coming in short, rapid gasps. The fake tears she had planned to shed were replaced by genuine, suffocating panic. She looked around the brilliantly lit study, seeing the handcuffed orderlies, the stern faces of the federal agents, and the cold, unyielding gaze of Victor Cross. She finally looked at me, sitting calmly in my leather armchair, entirely untouched by her venom. She took a desperate, trembling step toward my desk. She raised her hands in a placating gesture, her voice dropping into a sickeningly sweet, pleading register. She called out to me, referring to me as her daddy, desperately trying to construct a new lie. She swore that she only wanted to get me the best possible medical help because she was so incredibly worried about my health. She pointed a trembling finger at Derek, frantically attempting to throw her own husband to the wolves. She sobbed genuinely, now claiming that Derek had orchestrated the entire cartel money laundering scheme, completely behind her back. I did not move. I did not offer her a single ounce of comfort. I spoke in a voice so quiet and utterly devoid of emotion that it forced the entire room to fall completely silent. I told Melissa to stop talking immediately. I told her that I had listened to the encrypted audio file Jason had recovered from her private shell company transaction. I quoted her exact words back to her, repeating her chilling promise. Done. The word hung in the heavy air of the study, a final lethal judgment that completely severed the last remaining tie between us. I watched the realization wash over Melissa, freezing her desperate performance mid-breath. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a sudden paralyzing terror, as the absolute certainty of her failure finally settled into her mind. I shifted my gaze away from her trembling figure and looked directly at Derek. He was standing rigidly near the edge of the Persian rug, sweating profusely, his breath hitching in his chest. I reached into the lower drawer of my mahogany desk and pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. I tossed it across the polished wooden surface. It slid off the edge and landed with a heavy, definitive thud directly at the feet of my son-in-law. Derek looked down at the ledger as if it were a venomous snake. I told him in a voice that was perfectly calm and devoid of any warmth that the book contained the complete, unredacted financial records of the $25 million cartel debt he had attempted to bury within the logistics network of Caldwell Freight. I explained that Jason had successfully decrypted every single hidden account, every offshore routing number, and every fraudulent corporate invoice he had generated over the past 8 months. The FBI director had personally reviewed the files at 3 o'clock this morning. Derek began to shake violently. He opened his mouth to speak, but the commanding officer of the federal task force stepped forward, completely cutting him off. The agent stated that Derek was officially under federal arrest for massive corporate embezzlement, interstate money laundering, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Derek instinctively took a step backward, raising his hands in a pathetic, defensive gesture. He stammered frantically, claiming that he was forced into the operation, that the cartel had threatened his life, and that I did not understand the extreme physical danger he was in. He begged me to protect him, screaming that the syndicate enforcers would kill him if the federal authorities interfered with the corporate payment structure. I looked at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the surface of my desk, and delivered the final, crushing blow. I told Derek that he no longer needed to worry about the 3 violent enforcers he had secretly housed in the downtown luxury hotel. I calmly informed him that a specialized federal tactical unit had breached their hotel suite at exactly 4 o'clock this morning. The men he was so terrified of were currently sitting in heavily guarded federal interrogation rooms, completely stripped of their weapons and singing like birds to secure plea deals. I told him that they had already provided the prosecutors with a comprehensive map of the entire smuggling operation, explicitly naming him as the primary internal architect at Caldwell Freight. Derek stared at me, his eyes completely hollow, his mouth opening and closing, without producing a single sound. The total destruction of his illicit safety net shattered his mind. He collapsed to his knees right there on the pristine hardwood floor, his tailored suit wrinkling around him. He buried his face in his trembling hands and began to sob uncontrollably. The pathetic, ragged sounds of his weeping echoed through the silent study, a stark contrast to the arrogant swagger he had displayed just 10 minutes earlier. 2 armed federal agents immediately stepped forward, hauling Derek roughly to his feet. They secured his wrists in heavy steel handcuffs, the sharp metallic clicks cutting through his pathetic wailing. They began marching him toward the grand double doors, removing him from my home and from my life forever. As her husband was dragged away, Melissa finally snapped. The sheer, overwhelming reality of her impending incarceration broke through her carefully constructed facade of superiority. She fell heavily to her knees, exactly where Derek had just been kneeling, her designer dress pooling awkwardly around her on the rug. She looked up at me, her face streaked with genuine, desperate tears, and began to scream for my mercy. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, reaching out toward the heavy mahogany desk, pleading with me to stop the federal agents. She shouted that I was her father, her flesh and blood, and that I could not possibly allow them to lock her in a prison cell. She frantically blamed Derek for the entire conspiracy, crying out that he had manipulated her, that he had forced her to sign the psychiatric bribes, and that she was merely a victim of his financial desperation. She used her blood as a shield, screaming that we were family, that she was the only child I had left, and that a father must always protect his daughter. She begged me to remember Eleanor sobbing, that my late wife would never want her only child to be destroyed like this. The sheer audacity of her using the memory of the woman she had completely disappointed disgusted me to my very core. I sat perfectly still in my large leather armchair, staring down at the weeping woman kneeling on my floor. I did not feel a single trace of sympathy. I did not feel an ounce of the paternal instinct she was so desperately trying to invoke. I looked at her with absolute zero emotion. My heart was a fortress of solid ice. I let her scream, allowing the silence of the room to absorb her frantic, pathetic pleas. When she finally ran out of breath, gasping for air amidst her hysterical sobbing, I spoke. My voice was low, steady, and carried the heavy, undeniable weight of an absolute finality. I told Melissa that the daughter Eleanor and I had raised together died a long time ago. I explained that a true daughter does not hire mercenaries to drag her father out of his own home. A true daughter does not purchase a fraudulent medical diagnosis to trap her father in a heavily sedated permanent nightmare. A true daughter does not sell her family legacy to violent criminals to cover the debts of a cowardly husband. I stated clearly that she was not my blood anymore. She was nothing more than a treacherous, failed corporate raider who had drastically miscalculated her opponent. I told her that the federal warrants signed against her were ironclad and entirely unforgiving. I gestured toward the commanding officer of the task force standing near the doorway. I gave him a single definitive nod. 2 agents stepped forward, grabbing Melissa by the arms and pulling her forcefully to her feet. She kicked and screamed, her voice tearing through the grand foyer as they secured the handcuffs around her wrists. I watched her being dragged away, feeling nothing but profound, absolute peace. The storm had finally passed, and my empire remained completely unbroken. I turned my gaze toward the window, watching the morning sun break through the dark, heavy clouds. The brilliant light flooded the estate, washing away the lingering shadows of their pathetic conspiracy. I took a very slow, very deep breath, completely ready to rebuild my future today. I leaned down, slowly closing the physical distance between us, until she was forced to look directly into my eyes. Her desperate weeping faltered instantly, replaced by a trembling, suffocating silence. I spoke with a quiet, lethal precision. I reminded her that the sprawling Lincoln Park mansion she currently lived in, the imported luxury cars she drove, the expensive designer clothes she wore, and the very air she breathed were entirely funded and legally owned by my corporate trust. I informed her that at 3 o'clock this morning, while Victor was actively securing the federal arrest warrants, he also formally triggered the absolute morality clause embedded deeply within her financial trust fund agreement. By actively conspiring to commit federal fraud and attempted kidnapping against her primary benefactor, she had legally forfeited every single asset to her name. I told her that she had exactly 30 minutes to return to her lavish home and pack a single suitcase with her basic necessities. I clearly explained that absolutely no luxury items, jewelry, or electronics were permitted to leave the premises. Once that half hour expired, the local police department would permanently evict her from the property, throwing her directly onto the cold street with absolutely nothing to her name. She would have to find her own way from the gutter, completely stripped of the wealth she had taken for granted. Melissa let out a raw, guttural cry, a sound of total, absolute devastation, as the sheer magnitude of her ruin finally crushed her spirit entirely. She desperately lunged forward, trying to grab my hand in a final pathetic plea for mercy, but the armed federal agents were much faster. They hauled her backward violently, her manicured nails dragging uselessly across the expensive Persian rug, leaving faint parallel lines in the thick fabric. I stood perfectly still, watching with absolute zero emotion as the agents dragged my screaming, thrashing daughter out of the study and through the grand foyer. The heavy oak front doors closed behind them with a definitive echoing thud, that reverberated continuously through the completely empty cavernous corridors of the estate. The massive house was finally quiet. The toxic infection had been surgically removed from my life forever, leaving behind a profound sense of clarity. I turned to Victor, giving him a firm nod of profound gratitude for his impeccable execution of the countermeasure. We left the mansion together, walking past the massive fleet of flashing federal vehicles, and drove directly to the towering corporate headquarters of Caldwell Freight. The expansive executive offices were bustling with normal morning activity, the hard-working employees entirely unaware of the massive storm that had just passed through the very foundation of the company. I walked straight into the bustling financial department and found Jason sitting quietly at his desk, diligently reviewing the daily operational reports. I immediately called him into my main executive office. I looked at the young, brilliant single father who had risked absolutely everything to help me uncover the terrible truth. I told him that as of this exact moment, he was officially promoted to Chief Financial Officer of the entire global corporation. His eyes widened in sheer disbelief, realizing his life and his young daughter's future were permanently secured from any further financial hardship. I told him he had earned every single penny of his new executive salary through his unwavering loyalty. I took my seat behind the massive wooden desk, feeling the familiar heavy weight of absolute command settle comfortably over my broad shoulders. The greedy wolves had foolishly tried to tear down my legacy, but they had only managed to awaken the apex predator that built it in the first place. I was Harrison Caldwell, the founder, and I was finally back now at the helm of my undisputed empire, infinitely stronger, significantly sharper, and far more ruthless than I had ever been before in my whole life. Blood makes you related, but loyalty, respect, and integrity make you family. When the people you sacrificed your entire life for decide your existence is merely an inconvenience to their greed, you owe them absolutely nothing. Do not allow your love as a parent to be weaponized into a tool for your own destruction. True strength isn't just about building an empire. It's having the ruthless courage to tear down the parasites trying to steal it from you, even if they share your last name. Never let betrayal disguise itself as familial obligation. Protect your completely deserved peace starting today. Have you ever been betrayed by the very people you sacrificed everything to protect? How did you fight back? Drop your story in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button for more tales of ultimate payback. And let us keep exposing the truth together. Stay strong and protect your powerful legacy.